Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we are featuring a recent book by Kidada E. of Wayne State University entitled I Saw Death Coming, A History of Terror and Survival in the War Against Reconstruction, published last year by Bloomsbury. Our discussant this afternoon is Alex Lichtenstein of Indiana University. I'm Eric Arneson from the George Washington University. I co-chair the Washington History Seminar with Christian Osterman of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. He's traveling, can't be with us today. As some of you may know, the seminar, launched in 2010, has been a collaborative and nonpartisan initiative of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program and the American Historical Association. Before March of 2020, we gathered in person at the Wilson Center here in Washington, D.C. Since the summer of that fateful year, well, we've been gathering online, assembling participants from across the country and the globe. A few quick things before we get going. First, today's session is an AHA, American Historical Association, sponsored session. Second, as always, we like to recognize a key figure who works behind the scenes to make the seminars possible, and that's Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center. Third, take note, we reconvene this coming Monday, September 30th, just 4 days from now at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, to discuss Aaron Bateman's Weapons in Space, Technology, Politics, and the Rise and Fall of the Strategic Defense Initiative. Please mark your calendars. Fourth, on the logistics front, today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on the Washington History Seminar's YouTube page, where many, many dozens of past programs are archived. And finally, when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function or the Q&A function on Zoom. We'll call on as many folks as we can. And now we can get to it. Kidada Williams is professor of history at Wayne State University. She teaches African American history, U.S. history, and historical research methods. She's the author of They Left Great Marks on Me, African American Testimonies of Racial Violence from Emancipation to World War, published by New York University Press in 2012. She's the co-editor of the Charleston Syllabus, Readings on Race, Racism, and Racial Violence, published in 2016 by the University of Georgia Press. Her work, she has won fellowships from the Ford Foundation, and her most recent book, about which we'll be hearing today, I Saw Death Coming, A History of Terror and Survival in the War Against Reconstruction, received the Organization of American Historians Civil War and Reconstruction Book Prize for 2024, and was longlisted for a National Book Award in Nonfiction, and shortlisted for the Museum of African American History's Stone Book Award. She's appeared on NPR, PBS, MSNBC, and has published in the New York Times, Slate, and Bridge Magazine. Kidada, welcome to the Washington History Seminar.
Thank you so much for having me. So let's see, I want to thank Eric and Pete and everyone at the Wilson Center who helped organize this event. I'm also really grateful for Alex for joining this discussion. To provide a bit of context for our discussion, I'm going to tell the book story using one family, that of Abe and Eliza Lyon. So this is one part really short book reading, one part context. Abe and Eliza Lyon were lined up on the starting blocks when slavery was abolished. They had dreamed of this moment for most of their remembered lives, and so they sprinted to fulfill their visions of family, prosperity, and self-determination. By 1870, the family had accomplished a great deal. Abe was 30 years old, Eliza was 35. They got married, they set up a home in a little village in Choctaw County, Alabama. Abe was working as a blacksmith from his own shop. Eliza was keeping house. Their children were in school. They had amassed a herd of hogs, and they had saved $600, the relative worth of which is more than $200,000 today. They planned to buy land and build a home. Secession and the founding of the Confederacy were less than a decade in the past. Barely 5 years separated this family from the end of the Civil War. The Lyonses were living their best post-emancipation life, which provides context for the war that white Southern extremists waged on African Americans' freedom. Like many Americans, when I was in school, I was either not taught anything about Reconstruction or I was taught that it failed. That really didn't make much sense to me, but that's what my teacher said, so I really didn't study it until later, once I got to graduate school. And what happened is that the more I started to learn about the era, I started to understand how transformative this moment in US history was. There are many revolutionary developments: abolition, school openings, the establishment of churches, a boom in Black land ownership and entrepreneurship, national citizenship rights and protections, voting rights for Black men, and Black office holding. These are all the reasons why historians like Eric Foner refer to this era as the second founding. Families like Abe and Eliza Lyonses were part of this transformative moment. They had joined more than 4 million other Black people who tried to live upright and build a morally just world for their families after the Civil War. And so what we see is that what the records show is that by 1870, many Black Southerners had picked themselves up from slavery. They had reassembled their families to the best of their ability. They worked. They established their communities with churches, schools, orphanages, newspapers, mutual aid associations, and more. Some had acquired land and opened their own businesses like Abe had done. Others were working, being industrious, saving as much money as they could so they could buy their own homesteads. And to protect all of these rights and to secure their families' futures, Black men wanted to vote and serve in office. Some white Southerners who hadn't really given up the cause of subjugating and exploiting Black people saw these strides African Americans made as a threat to their ongoing mastery. And so they fight to sustain their privileges in the American system. We see that Confederates had, in fact, lowered their weapons against the United States Army, but they redirected their fire at Black people who were reaping the rewards of Reconstruction. In the spring of 1866, white men in Pulaski, Tennessee, formed social clubs where they sometimes donned masks and played pranks. Some of these men called themselves the Ku Klux Klan. Klansmen's activities spread really quickly across the South and evolved from these pranks to roaming armed through the countryside in the middle of the night, conducting paramilitary attacks on Black and other families. And this Klan violence is part of what I call the war on freedom. Now, it might seem odd to liken what we've been taught was, quote, the peace to war, but wars never end as neatly as they appear to in history books. They're often followed by these new conflicts. And after the Civil War, the new conflict was some white Southerners' ongoing fight to dominate all aspects of Black people's lives, just as they had during slavery. But one thing was different. Extremists were more likely to kill free Black people seizing their freedom. And so, as the historian George Rabel put it, there was no peace, especially not for many Black people trying to live freely in the South. And I argue African Americans like Abe and Eliza Lyon knew it. White extremists targeted Black people seizing their freedom with impunity. They stole Black children. They shot down Black male voters at the polls. They stalked and assassinated Black office holders. They kidnapped people at gunpoint, disappeared them, and disposed of their bodies in waterways, in the woods, or even just along the roads. We also know that they ambushed African-American families with these nighttime raids, where they held them hostage and subjected them to humiliation, rape, torture, and murder. White Southern extremists also committed countless massacres and other mass killing events as they were in the process of overthrowing Reconstruction. Black people resisted this violence, to be sure. As you can see from this image here, it says colored men going to vote. And if you look closely, what you can see is that they have arms to go vote, because they know that that's the only way they will be able to vote, is if they are armed and ready to defend themselves. So they do defend themselves, but the extremist violence is so widespread that African Americans often find themselves outmanned or outgunned, or we don't see the extremist violence in the areas where there's large numbers of Black people who are actively defending themselves. We also see that white Southerners conspire to disarm Black people, particularly Black militias, and this leaves thousands of Black men, women, and children vulnerable to be injured or killed in this violence. There are some federal troops stationed throughout the region, and some Black and white people are working together, but not nearly enough to quell the slaughter. And this is why I argue Reconstruction didn't just fall apart. White extremists overthrew it, and the rest of the nation essentially let them. And so I Saw Death Coming tells that story. It shows how Black people understood and articulated the human cost of Reconstruction's overthrow and abandonment. And it does that through the stories of people like Abe and Eliza Lyon. On June 6, 1871, Abe had spent the day in his blacksmithing shop, and Eliza had finished her homemaking tasks. Their children completed their chores, and everyone went to bed. Around 11 p.m., someone knocked on their door and asked if Abe was home. The family hadn't heard of any threats and were not thinking about such a thing, Eliza later said. That's why Abe answered that yes, he was home, and he got up out of bed to open the door. But something, we don't know what, but whatever it was, so terrified Abe that he didn't move. Human bodies and minds are wired to sustain themselves, and when under attack, focus solely on surviving and avoiding injury. When the mind detects threats to life, like Abe probably experienced, it triggers these pre-programmed escape plans by releasing chemicals to propel the body into action, specifically to survive by running, hiding, or fighting. But we also know that for some people, especially those who have a prior significant trauma, and we can imagine that a man who has survived slavery and the war probably had some prior significant trauma, but that when this happens, people who've experienced prior significant trauma, one of the things that can happen is that their brain's defense system shuts down and they freeze. And that's what I think happened to Abe. Because Eliza said Abe, quote, looked like he was in a perfect scare, like his feet were bolted to the floor, suggesting that he was completely paralyzed by fear. Abe remained in this trance-like state, prompting Eliza to do what she could to try to guide her husband to safety while protecting herself and their children. And so Eliza grabs Abe. She tries to steer him out the back door. He was so scared, she said. And she said he just wheels around the room in this scare, not knowing what to do. And Eliza's hope that he would come out of it is soon dashed because the invaders burst through the door. They throw a rope over his head and they drag him outside away from their home up a hill nearby. Eliza doesn't follow. She doesn't feel she can, not with the children in the house. But soon she sees the flash. And she hears the blast of a double-barrel shotgun. And then one of the men shouted an order for the gang to fire, and the rest of them did. After the terrorists killed Abe, Eliza spotted what she said were about 75 men returning to her home. I knew they were going to kill me, she said. So she runs inside to get her children. They leave out back, and they watch as the men make up a light and begin searching and ransacking their home. What was left of the family remained hidden until sunrise, when Eliza could see that the men were really gone. And that's when she went to confirm Abe's killing. Eliza and the children lost Abe, all of their cash, all of their possessions, that year's crop, their hogs, and most of Abe's tools. Their home had been destroyed, and the men's knowledge that they had left an adult witness meant that it wasn't safe for them to stay on the homestead. Eliza reported what happened to local authorities. A grand jury was convened to investigate the spate of paramilitary attacks, and spree killings in the community. But most of the witnesses were too afraid to talk. Initially, we know that Eliza was going to testify. It's not clear who or what spooked her, but the family soon fled to Demopolis. Targeted People's reports of atrocities to Freedmen's Bureau agents Army personnel, local, state, and federal officials, I argue, were like these urgent dispatches from the front lines of the war on Reconstruction. Receiving a flood of reports, like the one on Eliza's family, the U.S. Congress convened an investigation. The committee's work became known as the Klan hearings because of how prominently this organization and this violence featured in the investigations. Lawmakers traveled to some hot spots of Southern disorder, where they solicited testimony from office holders, voters, accused perpetrators, and their victims. Families like Abe and Eliza's had greeted emancipation with great expectations. Many of them, I argue, had achieved their dreams of freedom or were on their way to doing so when the men came for them. And so when Congress issues this call for witnesses, survivors like Eliza step forward, hoping to convince federal officials to take action to end this violence so these families could live in peace. Eliza, we learned from her testimony, and her children lost everything. And this is exactly what the white men waging war on Black people's freedom wanted: to destroy everything Black people had built after slavery and leave them with nothing. But facing the prospect that the world wouldn't know what was happening, survivors like Eliza stepped forward at great risk to themselves and reported what happened. And so what we see is that these brave survivors and witnesses make their way to hearing sites, and they're carrying with them stories of all of these violent attacks, as extremists are making clear their determination to sustain slavery as much as possible. Now, we know that enslavers had released Black people from bondage, but I argue that we see from who, when, and why extremists attacked that they didn't believe that Black people had the right to their children, to choose their sexual partners, to education, to free religious lives, to labor autonomy, to homes, land, businesses, to capital and political power to protect all of these rights. Eliza and other survivors and witnesses, their decision to testify, I argue, was informed by their individual and collective sense of self-love and self-respect. In naming their attackers, detailing their injuries, saying the names of their kin, and crying out for justice, survivors like Eliza said that Black people's lives, freedoms, and futures mattered. These testimonies did help drive the federal investigation that drove the Klan underground, but not before extremists had seriously undercut Black people's freedom and participation in American democracy. After extremists overthrew Reconstruction, they crafted the big lie that the experiment in American democracy had failed. And so they boarded up the Temple of Liberty. What we know is that it hadn't. But none of that mattered to the extremists and their supporters who were determined to deprive Black people of any opportunity to transcend slavery. And so what we see is that with Black people supposedly not knowing their place, extremists claim that they simply have no choice but to restore their honor, and that the only way they can do that is by forming these white terror gangs and then installing the apartheid system of Jim Crow. Members of Congress, presidents, the Supreme Court, I argue, had the power to enforce the Reconstruction Amendment and honor the Constitution, but overall lacked the will. I Saw Death Coming tells this story. I used stories or testimonies like Eliza's to lift up African-American families in the fires of freedom and the war against it. And I argue that what Black people targeted in the war after the Civil War knew and tried to communicate to anyone who would listen was that families were the cornerstones of Black liberation. And that's exactly why white extremists struck at the very heart of Black people's freedom when they moved to overthrow Reconstruction. Understanding Black family stories of racing into freedom and then the price white extremists made them pay in the war against it, I argue Americans learned that the arc of our history doesn't always bend toward justice. And I think a story like this one is essential for understanding why our struggle for freedom and justice and liberty continues more than a century and a half later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we proceed, let me say to those of you who are on this Zoom session that you can queue up for asking questions using the raise hand function I call on you, you unmute, you pose the question yourself with your own voice, or you use the Q&A function, in which case I read your question for you. So raise hand is our preferred way, but both are just fine. And you can get in the queue now. Our discussant this afternoon is Professor of History at Indiana University, the author of Twice the Work of Free Labor, The Political Economy of Convict Labor in the South, and the co-author of Margaret Bourke-White and the Dawn of Apartheid, and Unmarked Remembered, A Geography of American Memory. The co-curator of a recent installation of artworks focused on anti-lynching campaigns, he is also former editor of the American Historical Review, the journal of the American Historical Association. His articles have appeared in the South African Historical Journal, Working USA, International Review of Social History, Journal of Peasant Studies, Journal of African History, Labor, Studies in Working Class History, the Journal of Southern African Studies, Plantation Society in the Americas, and I'm sure I'm missing or forgetting a number of others, not to mention his many, many book chapters. Alex, it's a pleasure to have you back at the Washington History Seminar. Welcome.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, AHA. Thank you, the Wilson Center. Thank you, Kidada, for really opening the door for some of my comments. I was worried you would sort of say everything. So I think this will be a very fruitful set of discussions. So Kidada Williams's first monograph, as Eric pointed out at the beginning, They Left Great Marks on Me, used African-American testimony to explore the ongoing resistance to racist violence during the half century between emancipation and the racial pogroms of World War I. Building on this important first study, this newest work has really, I think, opened the study of lynching and racist violence by insisting that we understand these incidents not just as discrete events in time, shocking at the moment, of course, but as a wider form of terrorism that has reverberating and lasting effects on victims, their families, especially their families, actually, as you reminded me in your remarks, Kidada, and of course, the wider Black communities of which they were a part. As I Saw Death Coming so vividly illustrates, this is not just the application of armchair psychology or the glib language of trauma, inherited or otherwise, but rather a careful reckoning with very familiar yet underutilized historical sources that allow us empirically to chart the ongoing social, economic, and emotional costs of such violence over the long haul. In I Saw Death Coming, Williams has returned to a very traditional source indeed. And actually, I was surprised you didn't talk about this, Kidada, but somewhat glad because it allows me to highlight one of the achievements of this book. And that source is the Congressional Ku Klux Klan hearings of 1871 and 72, as she referenced. I would say the January 6th hearings of their day, perhaps. But really, I would say to use this traditional source and mine it for very, very new insights. Of course, scholars have often turned to these congressional hearings as a source for the political history of Reconstruction, that context which Kidada began describing. But this book reminds us that these hearings actually contain a great deal of courageous firsthand testimony from the survivors of white terror, as well as their families and their loved ones. In using this material and treating it in a way, I would say, and I was interested that you said apartheid, because to me, as I reread this stuff, I thought, well, this is a lot like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in post-apartheid South Africa, or perhaps other examples that one can think of current tribunals about human rights abuses. I think, to look at these testimonies in that light, which I think you do, and afterwards, perhaps you can talk about that. Kidada deploys a sophisticated approach to the archive combined with a deeply interdisciplinary understanding of how best to incorporate the concept of trauma, witnessing, testimony into her evidentiary base and indeed her larger argument about the repercussions long-term, not just of Reconstruction, but of course so-called redemption, as the white terrorists like to refer to it as. Here, Williams attempts to restore Black subjectivity to these accounts. In her words, seeking less to focus on the documentation of injury, although there's plenty of that, and much more on the ways, this is again, quote from the book, the ways Black victims made sense of the harm these injuries caused in their lives. Again, not only immediately, but of course, in the aftermath. This ability to document what Kidada calls storytelling chains offers the possibility for a radical rewriting of the history of Reconstruction in particular, and of the impact of white terror on Black lives, property, political representation, and family more generally. That effort achieves, I think, extraordinary results, drawing primarily on hundreds of freed people's testimony before the Klan hearings, and that map that she showed you indicates, again, a bit like the TRC, people weren't going to Washington to testify before Congress. These hearings were convened locally nearby, but not always that nearby, the communities in which the terror was occurring, just as the TRC traveled around South Africa to listen to the testimony of victims of apartheid locally. So she looks at that testimony and also revisits some of the WPA interviews with former slaves, again, here to show 60 years later what the potential memories of that moment of the 1870s were and how they persisted in family lore, for example, and memory. She shows how these brave men and women, and make no mistake, it took incredible courage to travel and testify before the congressional committee here, that these brave men and women rewrote the script, in her words, of the largely white investigators to get beyond the politics of Reconstruction and insist that, well, there's no other way to say this, to insist that Black lives mattered. That's what the people testifying before this commission were doing. Kidada matches the testimony usually, but not always, of the male head of households who were delegated to speak for Black people, matches that to their wide networks of kin and households. So again, the census work that goes into matching the testifier to their familial and household networks is really impressive, thus deeply enriching our view of Reconstruction families as they were beset by white terror, not individuals, or not only individuals. As Kidada says, she successfully listens to the long dormant testimony and, quote, accords victims authority over their own story, rather than imposing her own sensibilities as a good historian, or those of the historical interlocutors, that is, the members of Congress who were hearing this testimony, who often would ask questions that showed that they didn't fully get it, right? So Kidada manages to read against the grain to understand that. What I love about this research is that the material, in fact, has always been lying there in plain sight, right? This didn't take some sort of mysterious research. This is sort of the bedrock of Reconstruction research for generations, right? But historians have been looking at it with a different set of concerns, through different eyes, and with a different analytical toolkit, I think. I do think that this approach that Kidada models here will allow us to look at the Reconstruction period through a new lens. No mean feat, given how thoroughly this ground has been trod by many, many talented scholars, not counting William Dunning, but from W.E.B. Du Bois through Eric Foner, and then a whole generation of after Foner. I haven't really encountered anything quite like this since Leon Litwack's groundbreaking Been in the Storm So Long, which was 1979. Except Kidada's book also contains a clear explanatory model to understand counter-revolutionary racist violence as understood primarily by those who experienced it. It's filled with insights about victims, survivors, and perpetrators alike. Additionally, I Saw Death Coming casts a great deal of light on the nature of armed Black self-defense, as he showed in that Harper's Magazine image of going to vote carrying weapons in the 19th century, something we do not know nearly enough about still. I'm sure many scholars will investigate further this book's insights on that, on armed self-defense, and many other topics in the coming years. At its best, I Saw Death Coming asks us to reconsider what many of us believed we already knew about the history of racist atrocities during Reconstruction and after. As I reread the book, it rang so true to me, and yet I realized that very few people, if any, have quite taken this particular approach to this testimony. Material I thought I knew well took on an entirely new dimension, pushing well beyond the current scholarship on lynching, racist violence, and Black resilience by incorporating the experience of its victims' kin and working with insights from the study of trauma in other post-conflict contexts. Here I want to mention something that many historians, myself included, sometimes greet with skepticism, and that's the concept of intergenerational trauma, perhaps most applicable to descendants of the Holocaust, it is true that this rather malleable term can be prone to overinterpretation. That said, in my own recent work, which deals with the history, representation, and memory of lynching, and I should say here that the project that I co-curated has an advisory board, and Kidada sits on that advisory board, a full disclosure. In that work, I've gained new respect for this concept as applied to the Black condition in racist America. First, I've seen its effects as I've encountered communities with a deep history of racist violence, including lynching. Second, I've been profoundly moved by not just Kidada's book, but another one by Marie Crabtree called My Soul as a Witness, The Traumatic Afterlife of Lynching, which again looks at the reverberations of these atrocities. And third, I've been influenced by Kidada herself, in particular when she consulted with us about our anti-lynching art exhibit. She insisted that we needed to focus not just on the moment of the victim, but on what she called, I think it was your phrase, those left behind. Namely, that lynching should not be understood merely as a single searing act, but one with extreme ripple effects across time, space, kin networks, and of course, generations. With that in mind, we quickly saw artworks representing lynching and its aftermath in an entirely new light, down to and connecting it to the memory activism of today, an attempt to heal those long-term wounds by acknowledging them and telling the truth about them. And again, if you go get the book, Kidada puts this right up front, that, this is painful stuff to read. We really have to do so. If historians imagine that we speak for the dead, Kidada goes beyond this by allowing the dead and the terrorized to speak for themselves. She makes a powerful case for using different sources and reading traditional ones differently in order to restore the personhood of the victims of lynching, night riding, and other racist atrocities. A personhood that, despite its best intentions, too much scholarship still renders moot by relying on newspaper accounts, photographs, sociological data, and investigative reports. And I include my own work here as well. Instead, Williams has unearthed correspondence from and testimony by the victims and their kin to tell a very, very different kind of story of cool-headed terror, as she says, collective resistance and self-defense that potentially can gain a wide readership beyond the university. And again, I was looking at the list. I know there are lots of people who are not academics here. This is an extremely beautifully written and accessible work. Most significantly, this research allows her to illustrate Black people's clarity on the totalizing nature of attacks, again, quoting from the book, and the totalizing nature of these attacks on their dignity, their lives, their personhood, their property, and their memory, right? I think that's really key here. Naturally, much of this is indeed quite painful to read, but as Kidada insists, read it we must. For the book leaves one with a powerful understanding that this testimony and witness was indeed itself one of the most important weapons in the Black struggle for freedom, as it most definitely remains today. So thank you, Kidada, for writing such a moving book. Eric said I needed to end with some questions. My question, I suppose, would be, I would love to hear you talk a bit more about your approach to the Klan hearings and how you realized that this was a source that had been insufficiently mined to this point. Thanks.
Thank you for such a generous comment. I really appreciate it. Eric, were you going to say something? Okay, just making sure. So I think I first started reading the Klan hearings the way I was trained to read them, which is like how most historians were reading them, to focus on the event, to focus on the sort of political significance of the violence in terms of disfranchisement, and to home in on the politics of the hearings or the form in which the testimonies were collected. And that's how I was initially trained to do it. But that wasn't particularly satisfying because I felt that there was another story there. But I didn't have the tools to do it. And so I was looking for models. I was casting about. I was going to my advisors, et cetera. And then I, had a conversation with Elsa Barkley Brown. And what she said, I said, I was looking for models in U.S. history. And she laughed. She said, well, that's your first mistake. She said, you have to look outside of history and probably outside of the United States. And so it was Elsa who pointed me in the direction of the scholarship on what became post-colonial studies and what became critical trauma studies. So these are people who were working with, these are psychologists, psychiatrists, anthropologists, and sociologists who were working in conflict zones. or in post-conflict zones. So they're working with living survivors. And their experiences with living survivors taught them that there were things that they needed to pay attention to, that they needed to listen for. There were things that they needed to sit with to try to understand what a survivor was trying to communicate. And so I went down that rabbit hole and I tried to do what I could to bring back all of the insight that I gained about reading and understanding traumatic experiences and how complicated it is, trying to bring those tools back to history. And so that meant spending time with the DSM and trying to see and understand from the DSM-5, which is the self-reporting document that doctors use to try to see correlation or similarities between what I was seeing in the archive and what people recognize today as trauma. And I think I'll just sort of say really quickly, one of the things that we have is that with the survivors, they don't have the vocabulary of trauma that we have today. Right? They can't reach for these words easily and have people understand what they mean, but they are producing their own vocabulary of traumatic injury. And so what I needed to do was understand. I needed to sort of learn the vocabulary and understand what people were trying to communicate when Eliza said a perfect scare, right? The first time I read it, I probably glossed over it like a lot of historians do. And so what I was able to do through the work that I did in terms of critical trauma studies and post-colonial studies was to be able to sit with those stories and sit with those parts of the historical record to try to understand what they were trying to say, and then to translate that in a way that I thought readers could understand. So I started being trained like everyone else, but that was insufficient. And I've had enough conversations with anthropologists in particular who would push back on my statement that, this isn't knowable historically. I can't prove this for sure. And what the anthropologists would say is that you can't know it historically. That doesn't mean it can't be known. You have to recognize that the limitations of your profession and the ways that sometimes historians inflict violence on survivors of violence because they don't have absolutely perfect recall. And so it was those kinds of lessons that enabled me to go back to the records and to go through them again with a fine-tooth comb and sit with those stories a little bit more to try to unearth the story.
Am I supposed to ask more questions, Eric, or are we throwing it to the floor? Either's fine with me.
If you would like to pose another question or so, then we can open it up, but your call.
No, go ahead. Let's open it up. I'd like to hear what other people have to say. But
All
thank you,
right, then.
Kidada. That was exactly what I was gesturing towards, for sure.
We have got several people with hands up. We'll call first on Ellie Shermer and Diane Crothers. If you would stand by, coming up next. Ellie, unmute yourself.
Hi, I think this is working. Hi,
Yes.
Thank you both. Kidada Williams is also Alex Lichtenstein for this really sort of great session. I'm going to have to apologize because I have to leave at 4:00 Central to go teach. But I really enjoyed having this insight into your new work, Dr. Williams. So I actually just want to throw out there, because Alex mentioned that he saw, because I can't see who's in the meeting, about how familiar this text might be and the importance of seeing it with new eyes, as Dr. Williams did. Parts of it are actually available online through the old George Mason University History Matters website, which is, if anyone's interested in teaching it, it really works really well. I use it actually every year. I teach Reconstruction. But my questions for Dr. Williams: you mentioned actually about these different hotspots in terms of these moments of violence. And I was wondering if you were able to actually see, were it people from those real sort of hotspots in the South who were able to actually go to Congress? Did you get any insights about who was actually willing, who was able to go to go to Congress? And in terms of if there were any sort of different dynamics in terms of the experiences or the communities around to help people cope, those who are living in much more sort of rural areas, maybe those in smaller towns, and maybe if there was any sort of testimony. I'm sorry, I've only just used the excerpts that I can find online for my students, in a city like Atlanta or in New Orleans or anything like that. So if you can give us, do you see a sort of a way to sort of map the racial violence, but also the kinship communities and the communities surrounding to help people deal with this assault?
So I think there are two questions there. The answer to the first question is that first, people have to be physically able to travel, and there are a lot of people who are injured so bad that they can't travel. Um, you have to have people who have the time and money to travel. But they will go to these hotspots. They may not go to Washington, D.C., but the vast majority of them will go to the local, they will go to the area where the members of Congress may be in their county, or they may travel one county over. People will, in places like Atlanta, or in Georgia, they will travel greater distances. And they do that because they believe that it's important enough for them to go. One of the other things that we'll see is that members of Congress will hold the hearings in what will be some of the receiving communities for survivors. So people have already relocated. They are dreaming and hoping of going back home. And they happen to be there when members of Congress come. What we also know is that the violence and the hearings aren't happening everywhere. There are different types of violence that are happening everywhere, but the night riding raids are not necessarily happening everywhere. And so you also have a lot of resistance in Congress about the hearings and where they're conducted. And so even from the map that I have, those are only places where they went. There were many more places where they probably could or should have gone, but there was debate about whether or not they should do that, and often dealing with local politics. So if the governor had sent out the militia, they said, oh, we don't need to worry about this state. We don't need to conduct hearings from them. I think the other part of your question, so people went in to testify wherever they could. I think the other part of your question is that communities, I believe, are organizing. The challenge is finding documentation of it. What we find is that people are relocating. So I suspect that churches are stepping in these receiving communities, and even in some of the communities where the violence is happening. But if the church is stepping in, they're probably going to be targeted too. So it will be in those communities where the violence is not necessarily happening or not happening as bad, where we will probably find examples of churches stepping in. The thing is that the churches then leave documentation. What we also know is that, we see people who are hiring people that are helping them find housing. They're doing this kind of things. But we know that from the survivors, not necessarily because there was an organized campaign to help people, especially in the receiving communities. And so I think that the sort of Black codex of survival, of trying to help people and help people who've been targeted by this violence, that is real. It's something that we see, but we don't have as much documentation of it. And also what's happening is that as people are running from one community to the next, the violence will reach that next community, and then they'll have to relocate again.
Thank you. Diane Crothers, followed by Mary Pierce. So Mary, stand by. Diane, please unmute.
And there are also some questions on the Q&A, Eric. Have you seen those?
I am absolutely aware of that. I've got them all lined up here.
Thanks very much for helping me unmute. And thank you, Professor Williams. This is such an exciting book. I've read some of the reviews. My questions are about, I many years ago in the 70s was exposed to lynching and Reconstruction history, and I saw those congressional hearings over the years. I have some ancestors in Chickasaw County, Mississippi, who were there during Reconstruction. And one of the things that shows up in those hearings was about a white guy named Cornelius McBride, who was a teacher. And they were burning his schools down, and he had enormous difficulties. I also happen to have an ancestor who shot 3 white guys dead, well, one of them dead, at the time of the first Mississippi election right after the Civil War. My question is really about whether you know of any research about whether the white community, whether there were cracks in the white communities in these places, because it sort of lets the white community off the hook if all of them were as racist and as vicious as your book and most other literature suggests. But I'm interested in those people who could see what was happening with a different lens and who perhaps did something about it in concert or alone. Thank you so much.
So that's a great question. I think I have a 2-part answer. One, I think we have to recognize that there are white people who are targeted by this violence too. Stephanie McCurry is doing some research on them. And it's either Stephanie McCurry or one of her students is doing research on them. So there are cracks in this system, but I think we have to grapple with the reality, with the following reality. If there were that many cracks in the system, the violence wouldn't have happened in the first place, and more of the perpetrators would have actually been punished, right? So there are, the quote, good white people, who are helping, but there aren't enough of them. There just simply aren't enough of them. They're not enough to stop the violence. They're not enough to get justice after the fact. They're not enough to stop lynching. They're not enough to stop Jim Crow from being installed. So it is not a solid South. I fully recognize the diversity of the South. One of the reasons we know as much as we do about this violence is not only because Black people testify, because there were white people in positions of power who documented their stories. But I also think we have to be honest about the fact that if there were that many quote unquote good white people, then they would have actually stopped this violence and they would have made sure that people were punished for it, but they didn't.
Thank you. We have a number of comments in the Q&A, and one anonymous attendee asks, what parallels or contrast did you see to what happened in the North to similar families in this era? Also, did you see anything that surprised you? Were people of other races targeted? And if so, how did it contrast with the attacks on Black families?
So we've got a much smaller population of Black people in the northern and western states. People like to leave out the West, and I argue we should not do that. And so you've got a much smaller Black population there, and it's, they're experiencing anti-Black violence, but not to the same degree as happening in the South, which is where the vast majority of the population lives. Let's see, the question about other people being targeted. What we know is, as I said, just on answering the previous question, that we do have white people who are targeted during this time period. You do have violence against Asian Americans, particularly out West. What we have to reckon with is the violence of empire that's devastating the Native Americans during the period of Reconstruction too. Those are just topics I don't study. And so there's scholarship out there for it. But I focus on the Black victims of this violence.
Here's a question that you do address in the book, but you didn't talk about today, so here is a chance. Megan Easley Walsh asks, were there any Northern sources of support for the African-American victims? I'm wondering if, for example, dedicated abolitionists felt their cause was ended with the end of the war, or if any of them felt a moral imperative to keep lending their support.
So there are pockets of support, but I think one of the things that surprised me most, and this actually goes back to answer an unanswered question from the second part, from the last question, is how the sort of story that we've been told about the sort of quote abolitionist North is really quite problematic. It is not a solid, solidly abolitionist North. What we know is that abolitionists were a rump faction, white abolitionists, I should say, because Black people were the first abolitionists. You've got a rump faction of white abolitionists in the North and West, but the vast majority of the white population in the North and West, they're not abolitionists, and they're not necessarily in favor of emancipation. And they're not necessarily in favor of supplying resources to stop this violence. So I think the thing that surprised me the most, not so much in the book, but as I've been doing the research overall, was how indifferent so many white Northerners were and Westerners were to the violence. Their willingness to sort of turn their heads away from this violence and to ultimately leave the South, leave the white South, to do what it did.
Thank you, Alex.
Yeah, to follow up on some of these good questions. I mean, if I recall, the hearings aren't just about violence against freed slaves. They're also, and I would say in part, largely motivated by trying to protect white Republicans in the South, right? So a lot of it does focus on white Republicans who are being attacked by paramilitary groups of their Democratic opponents. So my question would be, did you come across or do you know of examples of essentially whites and blacks attacked together at the polls, for example, white Republicans and their black allies being attacked together, and then a hearing delving into that and whether, how interracial groups of victims were treated or not?
So I will say that there are examples where they are attacked together at polls. That's generally when they're voting. There are some meetings that are attacked, political meetings where people are attacked. But I would say that even afterwards, what you have is a kind of overall indifference by a lot of the local power brokers, unless the power brokers are white Republicans, right? If they are not white Republicans, and so remembering that this history of, the political power is changing across the region. It's not just static. So it's changed across the region. And so you could have, a governor send in a militia, but you could also not, depending on who that governor is and what their politics are. And so I think that there is this kind of larger indifference in the South, in a lot of the sort of white conservative South, to the white Republican victims of this violence. They don't necessarily care more about them than they do about the black victims. But the white Republicans in the North and West, they care a little bit more about the white victims of
Right.
this.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Yeah.
So I'd like to weigh in with a question or two. So this book got me thinking a lot about a literature that I once was more immersed in than I currently am. But your stories are so vivid and so personal, and so the images are, you just lay them out so effectively. The violence, but just not the word violence or terrorism, but the experience. You walk us through it. You walk us through what happens. You walk us through the aftermath, and the detail is, quite brutal. So I wonder how, when you teach, how you present this material. You have a very particular aim in this book, and you're very effective in carrying it out. But it's a story of, yes, you talk about powerful families and resilience and the like, but a lot of terrible things are done to the people in these pages. And how do your students react to that? And how does this account, or many accounts, of violence against victims square with or fit with kind of a larger story of kind of Black political empowerment, and or resistance, and or survival, yes, but victimhood and agency. How does this get expressed, let's say, in the classroom when you teach this material, and how do your students respond?
Great question. One of the things that, I let my students know very early on is that we do history for grown folks, right? And so you've got to be able to sit with multiple truths at one time, and you have to have an honest, we have to confront the past with honesty. And a lot of that means acknowledging how violent it was. But holding space, one of the things I try to have my students do is to hold space for their emotional reaction to the violence that we're looking at, and then move towards the analysis that we are there to do, right? So we do both. One of the things that I know in my own work is that, and Alex referenced this earlier in terms of, what some people call pop culture trauma, where people are just sort of throwing around the word trauma, here, there, and everywhere. I argue that in order to do justice to victims of violence, you have to have an ethic of care. And that ethic of care means that you have to deal with your own personal issues. And then you have to be able to put those aside in order to faithfully witness what the records that survivors have left. And so we go through that practice in my classrooms in terms of, let's deal with our own stuff and then let's move into the analysis to understand what the survivor was trying to communicate and why. Did it land? Where, did it land then? Why or why not? And why does it resonate today? So those are some of the things that I ultimately end up doing in the classroom where we do have these conversations. What you're able to see when to your earlier point, Eric, about like how I slow an account of violence down to a crawl so you can see who's doing what, not only what's happening, but who's doing what and what's happening to them. In doing that kind of work, what my students are able to see is that agency is something that exists as though it's on a pivot. It's not one thing in an attack. There are moments where people have agency and they act on it. And then there are other times where they don't. When you're in a hostage situation, there's only so much power and control you have. And what they realize is that every move they make could get them killed, could get their wives killed, could get their children killed, their husbands killed. And so they are aware of this. And it's very clear in their testimonies. Well, I had a gun and I didn't shoot it because there were 75 men outside of my house. And if I shot, and with one case, there's a man, they've got their 2-day-old baby. Do you start shooting while you've got 45 men around your home with your 2-day-old baby in the house? No, you do not. You exercise a different type of agency to try to live, to try to survive. And that's what they do. They will accommodate, they will follow orders. They do the things that many of us would do if we experienced a home invasion today, right? Because they want to live. And so we see their agency go back and forth on a pivot, even when they are surrounded, even then when they're being held hostage, people resist in ways that make sense to them in the moment. But those moments are changing because of how long the attacks last. So that agency, as I said, goes back and forth on a pivot. And I'll let Alex weigh in here.
So, this is just to add, obviously those of us in the history classroom know this, but one of the things I'm always telling my students is stop using the passive voice. Don't tell me that they were attacked. Who attacked them? History includes, when you're talking about this kind of violence, you have to use the active voice and make it clear that there were actual living human beings doing this to other living human beings. And when you use the passive voice, you mystify that. Now, again, you're nodding your head, Kidada, because we all know this in the history classroom. But I think, those of you who are not in the history classroom, when you read history books, look for that passive voice. It's always a tell. It's a tell saying, well, I'm not really accounting for historical and moral responsibility here. That's my view. So I try to get my students to see that.
And I just want to follow up quickly. I think one of the things that may surprise people in the audience is that my students are not surprised by the violence that happens during the Reconstruction era because they understand the violence of slavery. You can't hold people in bondage. You can't hold people against their will without obscene levels of violence. And so my students have grappled with a lot of that violence in the first part of, so in African American History 1. So they understand how violent slavery is, and they also understand the mindset of the enslavers who've lost their sort of precious thing of holding Black people in bondage and how outraged they are by that. But I 100% agree with Alex about history and the passive voice, and particularly about stories of violence. Atrocities often hide in the passive voice. So we need to be honest about who's doing what. But I would argue that we also need to understand why, right? What they get out of it, how they're spinning this story, what they're able to achieve with it, how many people turn their heads and look the other way, how many lawmakers don't do anything, or yes, they may listen passively to the testimonies, but when it comes to enforcing the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law, due process of law, they don't do anything. So it's grappling with a lot of hard truths in the classroom and dealing with the fact that the sort of what I call the kindergarten stories that, young people or students in K through 12, that they're not only getting in kindergarten, those stories are still kindergarten level by the time many of them get to high school. And so they come into college and, I do history for grown folks. And so they are exposed to a very different history, and they are often outraged because they argue that we could deal with this a year ago, 2 years ago in high school. And so they're questioning what's happening in their education.
This raises a lot of points. But one thing that a point that you make in the book and your remarks reminded me of this. So you prepare your students with the history of slavery and the violence that is baked into it. But the book shows that this is like a different level of violence. Slavery is about, amongst other things, property, and property, if you kill it, no longer produces for you. Now the proverbial gloves are off because human beings aren't property, but they can be brutalized. And so, the mobs that you talk about don't exist in the same way in the antebellum period. But with regard to the mobs, if you jump ahead, I don't know, 60, 70 years, and you look at the 1950s and the Southern white responses to the civil rights movement, so citizens' councils, the Klan's revival, between public meetings of respectable white racists and undercover agents at Klan meetings, one gets a sense of how a mob is assembled, right? How you organize terrorism, in this case, against the civil rights movement. You use the number, 75 people are outside someone's house and you have to make a decision. And so I'm wondering, it's been a very long time since I studied this. I took a course in Reconstruction 43 years ago with John Blassingame. The literature was a bit different back then. So is there a literature on how mobs form in this period, how you go about assembling 75 people to go out night riding on, it appears, a fairly regular basis. All right, you're not home with your family, you're out terrorizing, torturing, and murdering people. How do those folks get together? How are they organized? How do they select their targets? This is not obviously the subject of your book, but could you speak to that if the literature addresses those questions?
Yes, I think that a great book, a recent book, is Elaine France Parsons' The Birth of the Ku Klux. And she talks about this. And what we learned is that the violence, the sort of opposition to Black people being free and enjoying civil and political rights is so widespread, you don't need a single organization. You have people that just sort of roll in and start rolling, they may participate in the raid and never do it again. They may participate in the lynching and never do it again. People are moving in and out of participating in this violence. They tap in whenever they can. And they may direct the violence, especially if they encounter a Black person who, a person they may have held in bondage, who's made it, who's succeeded. They may target someone who, there was an instance that I talk about in the book where there's a white woman who gets into a dispute with a Black woman about a washing hole where they're doing their laundry. And because the Black woman talks back to her, she doesn't feel like she has to defer to her. The white woman directs her husband and 5 men. And he, what he does is he gets his brother, he gets a neighbor or two, and maybe a friend, and then they go and terrorize the Black woman. And so what you'll see happen is that this will, this can get larger, depending on how organized they are, how many men they can organize. But you also see that it's in all of the institutions. So a particular institution for organizing this violence would be the church, white churches in the South. And so it's, this violence, it's, it is dispersed across the white society. And it's in all of the white institutions. And so again, people, they come in and out of it. They don't have to be, as Elaine's work discusses, she talks about the sort of embodied Klan in the sense that you don't need to be a member of a formal organization to get in on that kind of activity. And to do it just as you need to. You can organize people through your church. You can organize people through work. You can organize people through political meetings. You can organize it through an existing white terror organization. You can do it through a social club, because that's how much violence and how much opposition there is to Black people being free in the society. And I'll let Alex go.
So one of the things I wanted to ask, Kidada, that you haven't addressed yet, but I alluded to it a bit in my remarks, was the violence against memory, in a way. Both the ability of the Black community to carry memory of this, and again, you use the 1930s WPA stuff to show that, but also the way that the memory gets constructed later on. And Eric just alluded to the civil rights movement. And again, if you can see here, right, this refers to the Colfax so-called riot, which of course, all you have to do is read the sign and you can see 150 Black people were killed and 3 white people died. And it's called the Colfax riot. But of course, the numbers demonstrate that that's a massacre, not a riot. And this is a key moment in the overthrow of Reconstruction in Louisiana in 1873. So, and this sign, of course, was put up in the 1950s as a way of sticking a knife in the back of the civil rights movement. And I guess I've heard that it's recently was changed, but only very recently. So I guess if you can think about or talk a bit about how critical memory studies, for lack of a better term, has also informed your approach or could inform your approach.
I think it's informed my approach. You can see even in the hearings, so the games that perpetrators and their enablers played, there's no violence, or this is just the South, right? This is the culture, right? There's nothing new here. There's nothing to see here. So they're already engaging in this sort of epistemic violence about what's happening, right? They are saying, this isn't happening. They're gaslighting people. We do have the Klan hearings, but what you also see in the hearings are the ways that certain lawmakers are playing these games about, even with the record that they're trying to collect about what's happening. Are you sure you didn't do anything to cause this violence? They're asking those questions. They're playing those games about the history, about even as they're trying to get it onto the record. And so one of the arguments that I've made is that historians, I feel like, have gotten distracted by that, or they've kind of got wrapped around the axle of that. And they haven't paid as close attention to how African-American witnesses are pushing back, right? Aggressively pushing back and saying, no, you're not going to distort what I said. This is what actually happened to me. It's the women who bring their husband's coats with the knife wounds in it and the blood still on it, right? And the bullet wounds in it, to say this actually happened to me. So people are actively passing these stories down in Black families, in Black institutions. It's in the popular culture of the time period too. And one of the things I think that surprised me, not about writing the book, but about reaction to the book, is how many more families are digging into their family's history. So I've met some of the survivors of people who testified at the hearings. Right. Wow. And they know who their people are. And a lot of them are the ones who are lawmakers. And so we have, through Black genealogical work, we've got people discovering the records anew. And that was one of the reasons why, in writing the book, as a historian, I wanted to name everyone. We name everyone. But my editor said, you can't name everyone for a larger audience. There are too many people to keep up with. So you need to mute some of the names. And so that was hard, but what I ended up doing was creating that appendix where people can go and find the names of the witnesses and any family members that I may have known about. But this erasure of, I like Aimé Césaire's description of it as the forgetting machine. And this happens with settler colonialism. It happens with slavery. It happens with the war against freedom. Cue up the forgetting machine. And, part of that is this never happened. We're going to move past it. We got the lost cause narrative, which is not only about the Civil War. We've got that version of it that's for Reconstruction. And we're going to flood the spheres with all of this information talking about Reconstruction failing. and why we needed a Ku Klux Klan, et cetera. And we're going to take over the schools. We're going to do all of these things. But what we see is that Black people are still fighting against this, and they are passing information through their families and through Black institutions that may not appear on the public record, at least until the people die. Like the people who lived through the violence, once they die, some of those memories fade in families, and they are separated from their histories, particularly through the Great Migrations out of the South. And so what I'm seeing right now is more people are sort of combating this sort of larger history of erasure by accessing the records that exist and understanding and identifying who their kin are. And so what people have seen is through the records that I have, including the book, they're able to take a look in the book to see if they have, a family member who's listed in the appendix, and maybe find a little bit more information about them than they had before. Because the census is useful, but it only gives you so much.
But so you provide the appendix almost as a tool to recover the memory of the descendants of the people who are the victims and the witnesses in the 1870s. Yeah, cool.
You have I think, a moving sentence toward the end of the book, or at the end of the book, that you say, thanks to some survivors' brave decisions to report attacks to local magistrates, testify at the Ku Klux Klan and Exoduster hearings, and pass on stories to their offspring and to the nation in WPA interviews, the history was preserved in the national record as monuments to the unrealized promise of Reconstruction, that history was waiting for anyone to claim it and tell it. End of quote. We have one other question from someone in the audience, also anonymous. Your quote here, refers to the brave decision to testify at the KKK hearings, and one of the attendees is asking about consequences for those who braved local circumstance and put themselves forward. Did anyone get arrested based on the hearings, they asked? What was the larger response in the white community?
So I think there is no one white community, just like there's no one Black community. But I think what we see is that you have to remember that the investigation, the congressional hearings, were a fact-finding mission. They were there to try to understand the sort of conditions in the late insurrectionary states. They were not necessarily going to prosecute people. What happens before the hearings, the sort of final impetus to conducting the hearings, will be the Department of Treasury at this time, where the Department of Justice uses Department of Treasury agents to go south to investigate the violence. The Department of Justice didn't have an infrastructure at the time, so you've got Treasury agents that are going south to conduct these investigations. So they're investigating, they are arresting, they are trying some of the known attackers. But part of what happens is that there is a larger fight over federal authority conducting the investigations and even having the trials. And what we will see is that even where there are convictions, the convicted people rarely serve time. They're pardoned by their governors, or they don't even show up. They don't report when they're supposed to be incarcerated. The questioner didn't ask this question, but I'm going to answer it. What we also see is that African Americans, and this is related to those who testify, Blacks and whites, people are attacked for testifying. We see a number of people who are attacked on their way to testify. And in subsequent hearings and subsequent congressional investigations, we hear reports of people who were killed as a result of testifying in the Klan hearings. And so the consequences are real for people who are targeted by this violence.
I have another question that will bring us from history to the present. One of the advantages for some people of using the passive voice, since this has come up before, is it obscures the actor carrying out the action, the agent, the perpetrators. And you write in the active voice, and it's very clear that there are a large number of perpetrators and an even vaster number of people who look the other way, who condone or applaud in secret. That's then, this is now. History touches a nerve. It is highly controversial in many places. And in some states, there are restrictions on how history can be taught, and history that makes various groups feel uncomfortable is bracketed and prohibited or restricted. This book, if it doesn't make a reader uncomfortable, there's something wrong with that reader, because of just the level of detail of the brutality. So I am just wondering if you have experience with this, on how this book goes down amongst teachers in those parts of the country, in those states that place limitations on historians' work for reaching either high school kids or college kids, because this book would inflame, I would imagine, if there are people to be inflamed.
So yes, I think, I call these white comfort bills, right? Because they center white comfort. They don't acknowledge Black and brown discomfort with some of the histories, with prior histories, and even some of the ongoing histories that we have being taught. And so like I haven't really encountered much. What I have said, because I work with teachers during summer institutes, is to don't assign my book, right? Maybe assign some of the Klan hearings, or go to the records that, go to the educational resources that the Smithsonian has, that the Library of Congress has, that the National Archives has. You've got all of these wonderful institutions that are grappling with, that work with teachers to create lesson plans for different levels to teach this history. And I was in Texas. Was it 2 years ago? I think it was 2 years ago. No, it was last year. I was in Texas last year working with some teachers. And what we were able to do is to sort of think and strategize about the kind of source that you might use. So rather than reading a piece of work that's written today, just go to the records. We talked about how to teach these. I was working with, at one point, some people who were teaching like 7th grade, and we could use some of those Thomas Nast illustrations, like Patience on a Monument, right? To sort of really teach and get into the history of Reconstruction and the overthrow in ways that are being mindful of what agents of the state are doing. What I also know is that teaching enslaved people to read and write was banned in a number of states. It wasn't banned in all of the enslaving states, but in a number of them. But that didn't mean that Black people didn't learn how to read and write, right? There was this larger fugitive pedagogy that existed during this time period. And so people are learning how to read and write. And what I also know is that for the longest time, schools, particularly historically white schools, were excluding histories like this overall. So this isn't new to people who are African Americans. There's a longer history of exclusion and silencing, but that didn't mean that young Black people didn't learn this history. They did, but it was in Black controlled spaces. And so what I'm seeing is more conversations about the education that takes place in the classroom and the education that can take place in a variety of spaces. And so I'm heartened by those communities that are organizing to teach young people a larger, better history. And what I'm also heartened by are the young people who want to learn this history. They don't love their country any less. They sort of look at it differently and make an argument that we can do better. But I argue that that's what the bills are designed to stop from happening, right? The bills are designed to stop people from knowing about how bad and good the history was, right? Because they're worried about people taking this knowledge and building a better world. And so if you cut them off from this history, then maybe they won't see, we've been dealing with this issue for a really long time. Now's the time for our generation to do better. And rather than allow that to happen, they want to cut them off from knowledge.
Thank you. Alex, do you have restrictions in Indiana?
Well, it's interesting. There's a new bill called SEA 202, which mandates that in the college classroom we must promote intellectual diversity. No one knows what that means. Whether that means, well, if we offer them readings from the Klan hearings, then perhaps we need to offer them. Well, I guess I do offer them sort of readings from the white supremacists, so that they can understand what they're saying. But no one quite understands what it means, but it is enforceable. And we now face post-tenure review. And the main question in your post-tenure review is not how many books have you published, but are you, in fact, teaching intellectual diversity? Now, most of us assume that means that we shouldn't be teaching the way that the kind of things that Kidada is talking about teaching. I'm not sure what we're supposed to be teaching. So we'll find out. But yes, it's and now our university is scrambling to figure out how to implement and enforce this. And those of goodwill are trying to figure out how to implement it and enforce it without really enforcing it. And those of ill will or those lacking courage, of which there's no shortage in my institution, are actually going to figure out how to enforce it. So we'll see what happens.
Good luck.
You heard it here first, folks. Yes, how many people are still on this? And this is being taped. You'll notice I didn't name any names. But so this is creating a crisis at Indiana University, for sure.
I will stay tuned. You mentioned earlier Margaret Burnham's book, which we did a session on, by Hands Now Known, kind of a naming of names of people, white people engaged in lynching and racial violence in the 20th century. And while I've not had occasion to teach that book, I did find one useful technique, and this is kind of a 20th century version of what you were talking about, Kidada, the newspaper accounts of the events that she writes about. You can reconstruct quite easily once she's identified what it is, whether it's a riot on a military base during World War II, or a murder in an urban area, a lynching in a rural one. There is sometimes coverage, and the primary sources can be powerful there too. And these are shorter readings than reading an entire book, but it's something that I've relied upon in lecturing to high school students and to college students as well.
I will say that, I had the pleasure of commenting on that book as well. And I guess Eric liked what I did since he invited me back. But similarly, Margaret Burnham draws on sort of traditional sources in a way, which are documentation of cases that the Justice Department was investigating, but which then ended up as cold cases. But she goes back, or has her research assistants at Northeastern Law School go back and revisit these cases, and not just look at newspaper accounts, but find affidavits and testimony. And the victims or the victims' families get to speak, if I recall. And so again, a very powerful effort to not just tell the story, but to let the survivors of this violence speak in their own voices. And so it's a 20th century analog, I think, to what you've done for the overthrow of Reconstruction. It's really a great book. Do you know that book, Kidada? Have you? Yeah. By what's it called? By Parties Now Known. By Hands
Now Known.
Yeah. So it's an excellent
Persons Now Known
to your book. Yeah.
Yes, I'm very familiar with the work and have taught it. And yes, I think what we see is that a lot of times when historians have looked at this violence, they have, and we see this a lot with the scholarship on lynching, they have tried to understand what lynching said about the nation, said about politics, said about law enforcement, said about the South, said about American culture. And I feel like what she's trying to do and what I'm trying to do is to understand, to recognize that there's room for that, but there's also room to understand there's space that we can make for understanding what this meant and did to the families that were directly impacted by it. A lot of the scholarship on lynching focuses on, what Black political figures, Black public figures, what they thought about lynching, what they may have felt by sort of experiencing lynching vicariously. What we're trying to do is to say, yes, that's important, but so are the people who were right there, who were directly impacted by it. And that's why I love Marie Crabtree's work, because she really, she's able to work with survivors and their families to tell us a very different story about this violence.
And she uses, oral testimony, oral history, folklore. I mean, it's really quite fascinating. I mean, in some ways, what you're pointing to, it's what Sartre once said, right? We're not trying to figure out just what has been done to human beings, but what human beings have done with what has been done to them. So that's the story you tell. That's the story that Margaret Burnham tells. That's the story that Marie Crabtree tells by getting the survivors and the descendants to speak in their own voices. So it's a powerful, those three books together, I think, would make a really good basis for a course or just for someone to read. It should be linked in Amazon, let's put it that way, right? They probably are.
Good. Well, we're about at the end of our time, so I want to express my thanks to Kidada and Alex for this genuine conversation, which I've found quite stimulating. I was going to say enjoyed, but given the subject matter, that's not the right term. So that I've appreciated. And to those of you in the audience, I will remind you that we return in a few days on Monday, September 30th at 4 p.m. to explore a rather different subject. My GW colleague Aaron Bateman's new book, Weapons in Space, Technology, Politics, and the Rise and Fall of the Strategic Defense Initiative. And we hope you can join us. Thank you, everyone. Good night. Take care.